good? Okay. I'm going to call to order the City of Tallahassee Ethics Board, May 16th, 2007. We're in the City Commission chamber. It's 2 minutes after 4, so for us, we're right on time. We have the first item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes. Well, actually, before we do that, let me note that Mr. Currington is traveling and is not with us today, and we have, I'm pleased to say, Rick Figlio, who's also with Osley. Mr. Figlio has a very good background in a lot of areas of the law. Is licensed to practice in a couple of different states and before a number of the different federal courts. He was general counsel to Governor Christ and interim general counsel to Governor Scott. So I think he understands both the legal needs of groups like ours and the political environment in which we all operate. So we're pleased to have him here today, and I believe he's going to have a couple of speaking parts. That always makes life fun. I would also note that Ms. Phillips is excused for part of the meeting. She's having some minor back problems, so I think she's going to try to join us for our shade meeting, but probably will not be in this public portion of the meeting since she's trying to, I think, stay horizontal as much as she can. So the next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Does anyone have any questions, comments, edits, additions to the minutes from our April 18th meeting? Seeing none, Mr. Davis moves the minutes and Ms. McNeil seconds that motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. Item 3 is the ethics officer report. This again is in 3 pieces, and Ms. Meadows-Keefe will stop at the end of each piece for any questions we may have. You're recognized, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You will see reported to you activities that I've undertaken since the last time that we met, and highlights will include the work I did to prepare for this meeting, some community workshops that have occurred around the community about some different developments. We've also started workshops on various topics, including the budget. I was very pleased to see Ms. McNeil at the budget hearing last week, and we have continued to provide ethics education to employees, and then also to the Housing Authority, the local planning agency, and Parks and Recreation.
Okay. Any questions of Ms. Meadows-Keefe? I would just ask, since you have this issue's come up in several of our prior meetings, you did some ethics education sessions to employees. I assume those are getting their numbers down. I see that they're getting a little more routine, a little less catch up. And what's the average size in those?
It depends. Typically, we might have 20. The least number of people I've had maybe has been 7 or 8. A maximum group has been maybe 30 people. For example, with the firefighters, they have a hard time signing up for a particular time, so they just come when it's available and when they have a few hours to spare. So I've caught those gentlemen, I think, for the most part, and I continue to work with human resources to tweak our process. And to the extent we can, we're going to try to get a lot more online, maybe even using YouTube videos.
Okay, outstanding. Next portion of your report on the hotline.
You will see there that we have had a limited number of calls this month. I believe they were from the same individual, and you'll see how I responded to those, and provided the information the person requested, and then tried to ameliorate some of their concerns with the event listed in number 105. And it did turn out that there were, here, for those that are watching and not looking at documents, this person was concerned that there was an event that the city partially sponsored and that there was some fee associated with going. This person had an issue with that, and it turned out there were opportunities to attend for free. So I recommend closure of both of those calls.
Okay, well, let's deal with them separately. On 104, staff recommendation is to close. This one is about us requesting authority to address certain conflicts of interest. And I would note that in our, was it February letter to the City Commission, our annual report, we did make a request for expanded jurisdiction that included conflict of interest. So I think we've already done that. Yeah. We may well do it again next time we correspond to the City Commission. So, but does anybody have any questions, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, on number 104? Is there any objection to going ahead and closing this item, recognizing that we will continue as a board to work on our jurisdiction issues? Seeing none, I think we can close that. And then 105, which Ms. Meadows-Keefe just described to us, related to admission, paid admission, relating to events that are partially city-sponsored and a waiver of that admission fee for certain individuals. Are there any questions of Ms. Meadows-Keefe? Does anybody have any concerns about closing it? Okay, so I think we have agreement, then we would close that. Item 3 in your report is our budget.
This is the monthly budget report that you see each month, and I'd note there is really nothing out of the ordinary for this month, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, seeing none, I think we can move on. This looks pretty much like it did last month. The next item on the agenda is our ethics moment, and we have a chart on our complaint process. Ms. Meadows-Keefe is going to walk us briefly through this chart.
I'm actually going to travel down. Do you mind a few slides on it?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
And I'll note for you that I asked Ms. Meadows-Keefe to include this as opposed to doing more of one of her normal ethics moments, since some of the actions that we are authorized by ordinance to take do involve people's property interests, either in their employment or in their finances. And how we deal with that is, or how we get to impacting people's property interests is a result of this complaint process that we developed in the first year. So, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Thank you, and thank you for that introductory moment about that. And part of why the chair and I thought this was important is twofold, maybe threefold. First, we have members now who were not here when we went through this development process for how we handle complaints. So those of you that were here do remember the laborious, one journalist called it slogging process we went through to painstakingly develop our bylaws and processes. So that's point one, to kind of go through that with those of you that are new. Second, those of you that were here, you may have blanked that out because it was so dull and unpleasant. So here's an opportunity for a little bit of refreshment and what our motivations were. And then finally, 3, we have something we're dealing with and that we've dealt with for the last 2 meetings. So this will help to kind of contextualize that in terms of process. So this is that. Real quickly, this is what you all know the Independent Ethics Board's responsible for. I've highlighted in red the things that pertain to the complaint process that we're responsible for those. We're responsible for recommendations to the City Commission. We're responsible to investigate complaints and levy civil penalties. And again, that speaks to our role as a quasi-judicial board in that we do have that responsibility to adjudicate matters and then to effectuate penalties on people. This is just some quick information about our bylaws. We got bylaws stood up pretty quickly. We first met in February of 2015. Our bylaws were approved in June. We didn't get legal counsel on board. Can't see it.
Yeah, we're not seeing any slides.
My fault.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. This particular slide, and I'm just assuming everyone was seeing that. These bylaws were developed, and then we got legal counsel almost a year later, and we benefited very much from Mr. Currington's review of those bylaws. And then even since then, our board chair has given a due process committee, which was Mr. Davis and I, to go back through and make tweaks and recommendations for improvement. And actually, someone in the treasurer clerk's office who's responsible for maintaining bylaws for all of the city's different boards says we change our bylaws more than any board in the city. And actually, I think that's a positive for us, that as we detect issues and want to improve them, we act. So this is just to remind everyone that we took a very long collaborative process with this, and we established our probable cause and hearing process. When we talk about complaints, again, philosophically, the board opted to interpret the word complaint broadly, that we weren't going to narrow the funnel preliminarily for what we'd receive. We were going to take complaints, and we were going to take them from any number of sources. This reference here in the second bullet to 112.3242A just talks about the shade process and the confidentiality that shields information until the board does one of these 4 things as listed below here. Legal insufficiency, a waiver, a board deciding it will not investigate, and a board determining if probable cause exists. So this is the same standard that applies to the Ethics Commission, and we are incorporated within that. So it's a requirement for us. Where do complaints come from? First and foremost is the Ethics and Fraud Hotline. This is that report that I just got done giving. I always give the number out, 891-8813. I give that out everywhere I go so people can know it and call it. That's one way we have of getting complaints. Other ways are through email. We have a form, again, that we don't require people to swear to, and then the board can self-initiate a complaint. And that was courtesy of Mr. Currington's legal opinion. So if we don't get a complaint from outside, we can self-initiate, and that is a process the board's undertaking now for the first time. And this gives a process for complaints, and you'll see that the board has a wide range of issues that it can look at. The funnel narrows related to what we can actually take action and adjudicate on, as subsequent slides will show. That depending on what the complaint is about, that complaint could land any number of places. So employee conduct goes to HR, fraud, waste goes to the auditor, and on down the list. So you'll see that depending on the type of complaint, our bylaws indicate that this is how they'll get handled. There's 2 more here, that Florida Ethics Code violations. We don't handle those. We have a legal opinion that says we don't adjudicate those. We don't have that authority, so those go to the Ethics Commission. We have authority to investigate and dispose of violations of the City of Tallahassee Ethics Code. There are 2 provisions in this right now, and we've persevered in asking for additional provisions to be added, but right now we have 2. One is related to this supplemental disclosure form that the commissioners file with their Form 1s, and it requires some additional disclosures that Form 1 does not. So they have some enhanced disclosure that they have to do. So ostensibly, if a commissioner failed to file this form, the board could act on that violation. In a more detailed type of violation, the city does have expanded abstention requirements for city commissioners. And this is that if they think there's a conflict, they have to make what we're calling a reasonable inquiry to determine if a conflict exists. And a reasonable inquiry, you ask what that standard is. It's hard to quantify. Case law tends to interpret that in employment discrimination or in hiring. How much do you have to background check an employee before you allow them to deliver, say, furniture to your house? So cases interpreting reasonable inquiry generally refer to employment. But for this purpose, we talk about things like a commissioner needs to read the entire agenda item to make reasonable inquiry. So if they're just glossing through the agenda and there's like a really thick part, they have to read it to see if there's a reasonable chance they could have a conflict. Likewise, if they're an attorney and they think that there's a potential client of their law firm who could benefit from a vote, the best way to make that reasonable inquiry is to have your law firm run a conflict check. You wouldn't just ask a corporate representative that's a friend of yours, hey, do you know if my law firm happens to represent you? That's not reasonable. The best way to do that is to inquire of your law firm. And then the city goes on to define what business relationships are for purposes of this provision. So these are the 2 issues or the 2 things that the board now has authority over. The board has authority after they've looked at it to assess penalties, and these can range from an oral reprimand to a monetary fine. This is the slide that the chair referred you to at the beginning. It's not so easy to see on a slide. It's probably not even easy to see in your printed materials because it's pretty slow. But we labored through this flow chart just so that we would have a logical map of how complaints flow through this process from intake to resolution. And instead of kind of going through this, I do have kind of a description of what happens at various stages. So assuming somebody calls in with a complaint to me, you look at that legal sufficiency, what they're telling you on the phone. If what they're telling you violates the city ethics code, and if yes, you would put it on one track. If no, you would put it on another track. Does this belong at HR? Does this belong at the auditor? Where does this belong on law enforcement's desk? So that's generally done when I receive the complaint. And then it's reported on my sheet, and the board does the assessment as you just did a few minutes ago. The second stage would be that the board, there is legal sufficiency, or there's a thought that there could be legal sufficiency. The board then goes into a closed session to determine if the facts, if proven true, constitute a violation of the city ethics code. So there's not an expectation at this stage that there's extensive investigation. The standard, again, is you look at what's facially there on the complaint, and if it's true, does it fall within the board's authority? Or should it be referred elsewhere? And then the process either progresses if there's a violation, or it stops if there's not. But we can make public recommendations to the city at the conclusion of that stage. If we proceed on and through probable cause, we get to the hearing stage. So I've short-circuited this, and I do have a quick hypothetical, and this is Commissioner Scary Dad. His daughter is going to prom, and the boyfriend has hired a limo, and Scary Dad is concerned about this date, doesn't really approve of this gentleman, but decides to let the daughter go because he can't stand the drama at home anymore. So what he decides to do is borrow a police car, and he's going to follow the limo in the police car to make sure everything is copacetic on prom night, and if it's not, he's going to hit the blue light. Okay, so this comes out in the news media, and someone calls me and says, hey, Commissioner Scary Dad took this police cruiser out. That's not cool. So I get that, and I put that through my process. I ask myself, if this is true, does this constitute a violation of the two provisions of the City Ethics Code? And it doesn't. It really doesn't. Then I have to ask myself, where is the best home for this case? And there's a number of possibilities there. One is that it's a misuse of your office, and it's a misuse of your resources, right, to borrow that police cruiser. So that could be an issue perhaps for referral to law enforcement or to the Florida Commission on Ethics. Now, if that showed up on my spreadsheet, it wouldn't be in this specific of a type of description. I'd have Commissioner misused city resources. And if one of you had more specific questions and you wanted to know more, that's where we would go into the shade and discuss it, and you would determine if there's a legally sufficient basis for the board to proceed with adjudicating it, or if it's better served elsewhere. So that's how a case that's kind of silly would proceed through the process. And then you would decide perhaps it's a misuse of position and send it on to the Florida Commission on Ethics, along with possibly saying to the city, please give us authority to handle cases like this. So that, in a nutshell, is a description of our complaint process.
Any questions, Ms. Meadowskeef? Okay, well, in my own fashion, before you leave the microphone, I have a question. On the bottom left corner, it shows the path that we would go all the way. We'd find something within our jurisdiction to adjudicate. We'd enter a final order and enforce that final order. If the person about whom the order was entered objected to the final order, that final order would be appealable to whom?
It is appealable to the circuit court.
Okay, so our final action, if it is unacceptable to the person being complained about, would go before a circuit court judge.
That is correct.
And we would be in the position of defending ourselves in the circuit court, defending our action. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Meadowskeef. Item 5, public comment on agenda items. I have a couple of cards that I'll call on people on items 6 and 7. If there's anything else. Okay, let me actually just go to those. Item 6, I have a card from Mr. Poitevent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Ben Poitevant, 2341 Limerick Drive. Thank you for allowing me to speak on item 6, having to do with the board council's contract. I'm very hesitant to be here today to say anything on this item because Jerry Currington is a longtime friend, and he's an attorney that I have great respect for. And I'm sorry he's not here because I would be more comfortable, quite honestly, saying what I'm saying if he were here, so you know I'm not speaking behind his back. And so I do have great respect for Jerry Currington since our years at the Attorney General's office together many years ago. However, I wish to speak to the consideration by this board for a process. Not the attorney, but the process in which the attorney is selected. And I would simply ask this board to consider advertising and taking the appropriate steps, giving public notice of the vacancy, and contracting and announcing vacancies in the same procedure that's required of the city in all other similar paid or contract positions. This board is going to eventually be required to conduct investigations on city officials for contracting issues. And my suggestion would be that if this board does not contract in a manner on which you can rely in the future, as having set an example for what the city should do, and to announce the vacancy and to solicit applications, to solicit contract interest, that you're hamstringing yourself in future issues regarding contracting and ethics issues. So I would ask you to consider announcing the position, allowing others to apply, other law firms that may be interested, other attorneys, and doing the interview and review process. Quite honestly, I would hope that would be Jerry Currington, but because I do have great respect for him. But I ask you to honor the process and respect your current board counsel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Poitevant. I would point out, since it's the next item on the agenda, and I know we're supposed to go into our shade meeting at 4:30, so we've got about a minute. But the next item is the professional services contract. I would point out for the members that this is essentially a continuation of the contract that's in place. I think there are some technical, a few editorial type changes, but nothing of any substance. But the issue, and the current contract expires in June or in July? Expires in July, so it is not something on which we have to act today. Although if we were going to do as Mr. Poitevant suggested, we would probably need to make a decision to do that pretty quickly.
That's correct, and that's why it's here today. So.
Okay. So let's just talk now about this professional services contract quickly. Are there board members who have comments, concerns, questions, either about the contract or about Mr. Poitevant's concerns relating to the renewal of the contract?
I have a question. How was the original contract? How did that begin, or how was it? Was it competed? How did that come about?
No, when we were initially organizing, we were pretty much flying by the seat of our pants, and in one of our early meetings, trying to get things moving quickly, the board delegated to the chair to go out and find a general counsel. So the prior chair went out and found Mr. Currington and signed a contract with him pursuant to that delegation.
Talk about how he was reviewed. We did review his performance.
I mean, Ms. Meadows-Keefe is pointing out that we have reviewed it, but it was handled largely by the prior chair under a delegation. Any other questions? Concerns? Is there a general feeling that people want to move forward on this, or that people want to go through a procurement process? Or is there no feeling one way or the other and a need to digest things?
I would say that being involved in contracting myself and starting some things from scratch, it is always best to compete and to have it be open process. In that case, then there is, it's transparent, it's open, it's fair by all accounts, and it can't go back to whoever the prior chair was to say, yeah, I picked such and such firm or such and such attorney because I knew they were good, but there could be other, reasons behind that. And, especially for an ethics board, I think it's probably the best course of action.
Are you implying there's more than one good attorney in Florida? Some people.
Yes, actually, I would imply that.
Oh, okay. Well, that's, thank you.
His performance was evaluated, remember?
Oh, and
he did have a performance
And
evaluation.
Ms. Meadowskeef's also pointing out we did do a performance evaluation, the same as at about the same time we did her performance evaluation.
Correct, on the same day,
So we have done the after selection part of the process, I think, playing by a slightly different set of rules. Yes, ma'am.
I think the timing, I'd certainly consider Mr. Pointevent's point, but I think our timing is a little off. It might be something we could consider next year, certainly, or 6 months down the road, but don't want to delay if the timing is a problem.
Okay. Well, let me ask a question of Ms. Meadowskeef. What would happen if we went back to Mr. Currington and asked for this to be a one-year contract with an agreement that a year from now we would go through a procurement process?
I'm happy to convey that information to Mr. Currington, and I would point out this is a unique client. So it's not like any other kind of client, and his unique understanding is something that we'd have to make sure the next person was ready to just dive in right where he left off. So the board would be served better probably through a more deliberative process.
Okay, I'm going to take Ms. Phillips' comments as moving as a motion to do that, that we move forward with this as a one-year extension of essentially the current situation with a specific portion of that, not in the contract obviously or in the agreement, but specifically saying that we would do a bid or some kind of formal procurement 10 months or whatever from now for the next contract. And I think Ms. McNeil seconded that. I saw her nodding. Is there anyone who would have an objection to that? Seeing no objection. Okay, we will put this on the agenda for next time after we've had a chance to get a response from Mr. Currington, and it will be back before us. That was item 7. Item 8, let's do item 8 very quickly because I know we have several cards on item 8. This will put us a little late for our shade meeting, but I think it is something we probably ought to do before the shade meeting. I would the cards in the order I got them were Mr. Butzine on item 8 on the informal opinion by the board council.
I'd like to suggest that Mr. Pointevent go before me, and if he doesn't say, we just saw Mr. Currington's memo, and Mr. Pointevent is an attorney, I am not. So I would defer to him, and if I need to add something, I'd like to give the option.
Okay. Could Mr. Figlio summarize this, or would you do it?
Do what?
Summarize the opinion.
Maybe we could ask Mr. Figlio
Okay.
to...
Mr. Figlio, I'm going to ask you if you could give us the nickel tour of this opinion before we take testimony, just so everybody will know, anybody watching or on the video would know what it is we're talking about as opposed to item 8 on the agenda.
What we asked.
Sure. We're talking about Mr. Currington's informal opinion to the board dated May 1st, 2017. The question presented was whether an alleged violation of the loyalty oath contained in Section 2.3 of the city's ethics code falls within the jurisdiction of the ethics board. to allow the board, if a violation is found, to take official action. Without getting into any commentary, the summary opinion is that while the loyalty oath falls within the jurisdiction of the ethics board, the board does not have the authority to level penalties against city officials, officers, employees, board members, etc., for violations of the loyalty oath. The summary of the opinion relates to essentially the guidepost that Ms. Meadows-Keith addressed earlier, which is there are two very specific portions of the ethics code that enumerate and delineate concrete violations, and the loyalty oath contains aspirational language with no finite penalties. And so Mr. Currington's opinion was that does not satisfy the requirements of Florida constitutional law for concrete violation.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Poitevin, you're recognized, sir. If you two are done collaborating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to argue against Mr. Currington's opinion. That's not at this time. I reserve the right to do later. Again, I have great respect for Jerry's opinions on most matters. It occurs to me, however, that since we're going to have Jerry for another year, apparently, and that's certainly fine with me, wise decision on your part, perhaps, if you're going to take somebody in disregard of the contracting process or of the announcement process. We have an excellent legal mind available to us, and this board, in my humble opinion, has a duty to go to that council for every legal issue that arises. Mr. Currington also has a duty to speak to this board when he sees the board may or may not be drifting outside its jurisdiction or outside the law. So it's a give and take, and it occurs to me that having read his opinion, there are a number of hurdles that have to be overcome. Since we have the brilliance of Mr. Currington available for another year, why not have this board request Mr. Currington to draft the necessary language to resolve the conflicts or the vagueness issues that he has brought up in his opinion. Simply draft what you need, whether it's an ethics code, whatever it may be, it needs to be presented to the City Commission. Let him draft it, since he knows the shortcomings of the current situation. So my proposal to you is just simply ask, direct or request Mr. Currington to draft the necessary documents to overcome the weaknesses, if you will, that this board now faces based on his opinion.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Putzine, are you?
Very, very quickly. I think after reading that, my name is Peter Butzine, 1628 Woodgate Way. After reading that opinion, it made me understand why I never went into the law. My training was in theology and history, and I've always felt that lawyers are very good at coming up with convoluted arguments, and this is no exception to that. In my opinion, it's only logical that even if the board cannot invoke penalties, it certainly has the right, indeed the obligation, to investigate and bring findings relating to possible violations of the city's ethics oath. I think what we may be able to agree, the coalition and this board, is that the City Commission needs to amend the city's ethics code so that it is enforceable. But in the absence of such action, if the ethics code and the oath of office are indeed unenforceable, then I think that we need to remind the 67% of the voters who approved the charter amendment in 2014 that the city commission is clearly ignoring their mandate. And that would be the only thing that I would wish to add to Mr. Pointovan's testimony.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Petzine. And Mr. Wilcox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm Ben Wilcox with Citizens for Ethics Reform. A little bit disappointed in Mr. Currington's memo, but I think you still have some options. As Mr. Petzine just mentioned, Mr. Currington did find that the loyalty oath falls under your jurisdiction. So I believe while you can't penalize somebody for violating it, you can find a violation and at least make that public. Another option you would have, as Ms. Meadows-Keefe was talking about the options before this board as far as self-initiating a complaint, you could self-initiate a complaint and refer it to the State Commission on Ethics if you believe there are violations of Chapter 112. So I would also like to, I'm wondering if you have heard anything from the City Commission as far as their intent to take action on your recommended ordinance. I kind of find it a little bit disgraceful if they're simply ignoring you, especially with the cloud of ethics that is hanging over the city right now. So,
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. I will pose that question to Ms. Meadows-Keefe since I don't talk to city officials, but she's here in the building. And do you know how our February letter was received?
I have not spoken individually to particular commissioners. The city attorney has indicated to me, however, that he has discussed with each commissioner the contents of our letter. And in fact, I neglected to mention this in my report. Several of the recommendations have been implemented or are being implemented. For example, the anti-fraternization policy is now final. That's going to be on your June agenda. So the more minor recommendations we made, a lot of those have been implemented. I know what you all are talking about. Is improvements and supplements to the city ethics code. You heard from the city attorney what his thoughts were on that, but he has continued to discuss with the commission that there's going to come an inevitable point where the question will be asked and the commission's going to have to make a choice on whether they're going to grant more authority or not. So the discussion is continuing. And so I do anticipate that it'll be on an upcoming city commission agenda. I do know they have to do a budget and they have a summer recess. But I would anticipate definitely before we conclude this calendar year, this issue will have been raised to the commission in a public meeting.
And for the half of the board who is newer, I would just remind people that we spent good hunks of our November, December 2016 and January and February 2017 meetings talking about expanding our jurisdiction, the limitations of our jurisdiction where we can take formal action as a board on ethics matters, and drafting recommendations to the city that were included in our annual report that was presented to the city. Ms. Phillips.
I have a question of the last speaker, if I might. You said, and I thought Mr. Pointovat also said something, that you were disappointed in Mr. Currington's opinion, and I don't quite understand what that means.
well,
Do you think it's incorrect, or, I guess that's where I'm headed.
right, Mr. Chair.
You're recognized.
I'm not a lawyer, and I guess I'm speaking from, the viewpoint, I think, of the members of the public that would like to see this board be able to enforce an ethics code. And the fact that, you're saying you can't apply penalties to violations of what little ethics code that we have is disappointing to me.
You good? Thank you. Mr. Poitevin has a one last comment, and then we're going to break and go into our shade meeting.
Thank you for tolerating me the third time, Mr. Chairman.
Third time's the charm, Mr. Poitevin.
The point that's being made, obviously, is that based on Mr. Currington's informal opinion, this board does not have the authority to impose penalties. And that, again, I won't argue that legal point at this time. But the board certainly does have, according to his informal opinion, the authority to move forward in investigations and make findings one way or the other, even if penalties are not imposed. And I would argue that's incumbent on the board to move forward, let the public know what the findings are, even if there is no penalty.
Thank you, Mr. Poitevin. With that, are there comments or questions from board members? Mr. Davis.
Mr. Chairman, this is a point that really bothers me a lot, and so I'll make a few comments, and I've made some of these to Julie by way of an email after our last meeting, but the recommendations we've made to the City Commission, we've been asked by the city through this referendum to work with the City Commission in the development of the ethics code. Obviously, that's a two-party process. We've got our role, and then they're going to have to participate one way or the other in either accepting our recommendations or rejecting them. But we've got to do our part. If we feel like a recommendation is appropriate, we need to do our part, our good faith effort to honor our duties. And it seems to me the recommendations we've made to the city, the three basic fundamental recommendations to the ethics code, are found in every other ethics board in the state of Florida that we've looked to. And I've asked Julie if she would consider doing this, but my guess is if we look to major cities like Tallahassee and look to, even if they didn't have an ethics board and their city ethics code provisions, they probably have these provisions. They are basic ethics provisions. It seems to me that I'm struggling to understand why they haven't existed since the beginning of the City of Tallahassee Ethics Code. Now, I may be ignorant in saying that, but it seems to me they're elementary principles for an ethics code. We've been charged to improve this ethics code. We've made recommendations. We deserve a response. And I don't know why we haven't received a response. It troubles me we don't have a response. And it seems to me we ought to be setting an appointment to try to be on the agenda of the City Commission. You or some member of this committee to speak to the City Commission and say, we've made these recommendations. They're on every ethics code that we've turned to where a city has an ethics code. We've turned to looked to other cities. They have these provisions. We would like your response. And we would like your response as quickly as possible. And move this thing along. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Davis. I'm going to put that on as a number 10 agenda item, board discussion regarding items desired for future agendas. So I think that is a good one for us to start with next month. And maybe we can have some very specific things in front of us to look at. To pursue that, and I know that Ms. Meadows-Keefe reminds me the city attorney will be back. He is not here at I think this week, but he will be back, and I'm sure that we can find some way to compel his attendance. Maybe it takes, since we don't have subpoena powers, maybe it takes donut powers. I don't know.
No, he'll come up this year.
Or just a simple request. But I think we're seeing everyone nod their heads on that one. So that said, we are going to go into our 4:30, very late, shade meeting, and we will be back, but I think we've been through all the business, so those of you who don't feel compelled to sit here, anything that if we resolve it today, the results will be immediately available, and if we don't resolve it today, we'll be back next month. Thank you.
So you brought
for you. Okay, it is 6:15. Call the City of Tallahassee Ethics Board back to order. We just came out of our shade meeting, which was continued from last month. Specifically, we were looking at the issue of the mayor's use of email, which has been reported in the paper, and we've received, that I know of, a couple of emails that fell short of being complaints. Specifically, we looked at whether or not we, as a board, would self-initiate a complaint, and simultaneous with that, we held a discussion of whether or not, if we did self-initiate a complaint, it would be legally sufficient under the ordinance that defines our jurisdiction. We also looked at at several hundred pages of materials, including a lot of emails, to determine whether or not there was behavior there that warranted self-initiating complaint. And we have an order coming out of that we will not self-initiate a complaint regarding the misuse of city resources. That said, I would move on to another issue, and I would recognize, I don't know if it's Mr. Grant or Mr. Davis. Does either one of you want to kind of take on where we go next? Or you want me to roll with this?
I think we'll let you roll with that.
All right. I think as a board, there was a lot of discussion that we were very concerned about our jurisdiction, and we were concerned about the use of city resources as they relate to non-city business, and more specifically as they might relate to campaign activities. So what we will do at the next meeting, while we don't have authority to, given the information that we have before us, to adjudicate any kind of complaint within our jurisdiction, we are going to look at the issue of writing a letter to the city, or a draft policy to the city, or including a draft ordinance to the city that would address both the issues, I think, of our jurisdiction and of the misuse of city resources by city officials. Anybody want to expand on that? So I think based on some of the things I heard, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, a couple of tasks for you. One would be to look at city ethics ordinances I think Tallahassee, the last time I looked, we were the 11th most populous city. So maybe if you looked at the 12 or so most populous cities in the state of Florida, to kind of limit it so that you're not looking at all, I don't know how many municipalities there are anymore, 460, which would be a little bit of overkill, but at least looking at the largest ones to kind of determine what they have in their ethics ordinances, specifically as it might relate to misuse of position or misuse of city resources. I think we were concerned as a board in terms of our jurisdiction that any expansion of our jurisdiction ought to be defined as broadly as possible, so that we can capture, that we not be given the kind of the two items that are within our jurisdiction now are both very narrow and related to very specific activities, that's something that is a little broader and allows us to capture more the type of information that we believe the citizens, based on the testimony we've heard, we believe the citizens would equate with ethical behavior broadly, rather than some narrow legalistic definition of an ethics ordinance violation. We'd like to be able to have something in draft to discuss and hopefully finalize at the next meeting that will go down that path. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
I'm happy to do that. And I would also like to have the board recall that one of the speakers talked about, I think it was Mr. Poitevant, talked about actually working with Mr. Currington relating to drafting language, because we have in the past provided the city with recommendations. Mr. Davis and I actually went through an exercise looking at other jurisdictions. I think it's beneficial not only to do that kind of research and put that in a letter, but to also have Currington have draft provisions. And then I'm going to ask Mr. Shelley to come to the next meeting, and hopefully before that meeting we can get a response from the city, and then Mr. Currington can present his draft language to the city attorney, because if you recall, when we were dealing with penalties, Mr. Currington came up with those penalties, and there was a negotiation between the city attorney and our attorney, and that's the proper posture to actually get the language drafted and before the commission. So my letter will do the things and execute those tasks as requested by Mr. Davis. Here's what other jurisdictions have done. But in terms of the drafting, it should, I think, be lawyer to lawyer, as it was with our penalties. Okay. He and Currington went back and forth a bunch of times. So if I'm allowed to engage Currington to do that, I will contact him when he returns.
Okay. And I'm also going to ask between now and the next meeting if Ms. Meadows-Keefe will get to the board members either the link to the State Ethics Commission annual report or provide the information. And I would encourage each of you to look at it. Contains some summaries, particularly the ones that were useful to me were looking at the categories of complaints that they receive, which ones were the most common, which ones they found violations of, so that we look at that again as we go back to this issue of our jurisdiction. I don't think that we probably can ask for everything that we might ultimately like to see, but I think that we can ask for expansion of our jurisdiction into those areas that we as a board believe are the most likely to allow us to improve the ethical environment of the city of Tallahassee. So that's it. Are there comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, just to recap, to make sure we all understand what we're saying here, because we had discussion previous, and that is, first and foremost, the Ethics Board does not believe that it has jurisdiction to investigate or look into this matter. And the fact is that we do not have a complaint in front of us then to look into. But if there were to be a complaint sometime in the future, then that would be something that the board would put on its agenda to consider.
That is correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, we would go right back into a shade meeting and conduct our business as we have.
But the primary reason for not handling this issue is because of the lack of jurisdiction according to current city ethics code and regulations or ordinances, I guess. Is that right? Have I got that right, though?
Yeah, I think there were.
I just want to make sure it's clear, so that, and I'm clear on it too.
I think there were two. Ms. Phillips, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe it's my understanding we have the jurisdiction, but we have no authority. We have the jurisdiction to initiate a complaint, but we have no authority under our current code of ethics.
Yes, my recollection of the discussion was that if we decided to self-initiate a complaint, the next step would have been whether or not it was legally sufficient. And because use of an email system does not fall within the two very specific categories over which we have jurisdiction under the ethics ordinance, that we would have immediately found that it was legally insufficient and we would have dismissed it. That being said, we did not. Anybody could have voted against self-initiated complaint for any reason. It was not necessarily that legal sufficiency issue. Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Chair, just to follow up for what the Vice Chair said. So the understanding is no jurisdiction and no authority to do anything about this. And that's something that the board apparently would like to remedy. Is that correct in the future?
Yes, I think Ms. Meadows-Keefe in one of her slides showed what our potential penalties are. So if we have jurisdiction and legal sufficiency, then all of those penalties would be open to us. So it is not the penalty side that is an issue. It is the narrowness of our jurisdiction related to two very specific topics that prevents us from being able to reach issues like misuse of city resources. Mr. Davis.
Mr. Chair, I don't know what the standard process is for a body like us communicating to the city commission. I don't know if you go through the city attorney or if you write each commissioner, but I wish we could write a letter to each commissioner and the city attorney and say, we were following up on our April report to you, our annual report of the activities of this ethics board, and our 3 recommendations in that April report to you for expanding the ethics code of the city of Tallahassee. And if you could get back with us as quickly as possible, we would appreciate it.
We'll be there. We'll be here in June.
That each person could receive that letter.
Okay. We'll have some draft language in front of us at the next meeting, and we'll make sure something like it would be just to each member, to the mayor and each member of the city commission, I think, is as well as the city attorney.
And the city attorney's already received an email invite from me to be present at the June meeting. So you guys can actually engage with him yourself on that issue.
And if I could just say one other thing, it's still my recommendation that we go ahead without delay and schedule one of our members, the chairman would be my preference, to get on the agenda of the city commission as soon as possible, to reiterate the recommendations we've made in the April report, and to do that without delay. That's just my thinking. I'm just one member of the board, but.
Well, if I can we wait on that until we get the result of the deliberations from the next meeting? Because if we have substantial change or substantial additions in our next meeting to what we sent them in February, I would want all of that to be presented to them and not just the February materials. I'm assuming that we may expand either expand or be much more specific than the recommendations we made in February.
In February, Mr. Chair, we were broad, and we didn't present draft language, and we did that on purpose. We wanted the city to do that. So it seems like now we're going to move to that next level and actually prepare the language and put it in front of them. So we kind of left it to them, and now we're going to take that initiative and do that ourselves.
Okay.
Okay.
So that buys me a little bit of time to become a fluent speaker.
Or quit the board.
Quit, yes, I resign. Any other questions or comments?
Don't you dare.
Come on, Vice Chair. With that, Ms. McNeil, I'll sign this afterwards. Ms. McNeil moves we rise.
And our next meeting. Our next meeting is Thursday, June 22nd, 2017, from 4 to 7. So it's a Thursday, not our usual Tuesday.
And it's here.
Here.
And we are done.
Yes.
Good to see you again.
Private sector.
Well, it's been a while now. It's like people don't. You know, it was really funny because so my wife is a veterinarian, which is a celebrity. And
This is a chair.
and for that brief window of time when I worked for the governor, you know, things like